Sound and Fury is actually a collection of transcripts of interviews that I've done during the COVID years. There is a introduction to the book that explains in detail how I look upon interviews and how I would distinguish between different types of interviews, what would be the approach of the interviewer in each of those cases, and other such things.
Mr. Thapar, I must ask you, of course, we're going to talk about Sound and Fury. But there's one thing that in our country is happening very often. We're seeing this, that there are two narratives. There's Modi's Bharat and Nehru's India. I keep saying that we should have Modi's India and Nehru's Bharat. A lot of people look at me and say, Rishabh, just like your hairstyle, you sometimes don't make sense. So with your belief and your understanding of what is happening in our country, journalism has always been the fourth pillar of democracy. It has been the reason why a lot of people and a lot of policy is made. A lot of people look at this, or look at journalism and then make policy. When it comes to young people, it's now either extremes. It's either Swarajya and Op India, or it is the wire. There are very few places like this platform where you've got diverse views on the same platform. Do you think that somewhere journalism has lost the original purpose of being the fourth pillar of democracy?
Yes, I do, is the short answer to your question. Whether it's lost it or whether it's in the process of losing it is, of course, open to discussion. But sadly, I think the process is accelerating. Let me talk about television because it's the side of journalism that I understand and know best. And I think what is terribly sad about television is that increasingly, and I'm judging mainly by the English language channels, they focus on a single subject and they exhaust it. There is needless discussion on small, irrelevant points. And I'll give you an example of it. Yesterday, NDTV at 5 in the evening held a discussion on the possibility that Congress and the Aam Aadmi Party may not be able to seat share in Punjab. That was a small little story based upon the fact that the Chief Minister had made an announcement that Aam Aadmi Party intended to contest all 13 seats. They carried on that discussion for half an hour. And I said to myself that all stories have a limit. This is a news program, not a discussion program. In a news program, you're expected to focus on the news, perhaps give it a bit of context and move on to other things. But to spend 25 minutes on a marginal story shows the lack of proportion in television channels. That's the smallest and the least of the problems they suffer from. The most serious problem is that they've lost their objectivity. They've become partial to the government. Most channels today have also become partial to winning audience attention through what I would call unnecessary attempts to make themselves popular. Again, look at the English language channels. They all have little digital on-screen graphics at the moment these days saying Ram returns. I've never heard of a news channel doing that. What on earth are they doing it for? The Ram Mandir is an event that is happening. It is no doubt an important event for many in this country. But to convert the entire nature of your channel to seek popularity through the Ram Mandir is to lose a sense of proportion and objectivity. But my greatest criticism of the channel, and not just NDTV, I'm only using it as an illustration, my greatest criticism of television channels is that they don't realize the difference between news and discussion. They don't realize the purpose of a discussion. And thirdly, the anchors usually believe that if the person they're speaking to doesn't agree with them, his viewpoint is different to that which is suggested in the question, they have to badger him or her until he or she agrees with them. And then the final point I'll make is that I think channels have become obsequious in the manner in which they approach, handle, respond, and cover the government. The object of a channel is to be balanced, objective, to be neutral, not to be propagandist on behalf of the government of the day. I'm deliberately measuring my words carefully because many of you perhaps are supporters of the government of the day. But nonetheless, despite the fact that I don't wish to offend you, I also wish to speak the truth in answer to your questions. And I think the biggest failing of journalism at the moment in our country is that that sense of impartiality, objectivity, the capacity to speak truth to power has gone from us very substantially.
So you've mentioned a couple of points and very eloquently put in terms of the responsibility of journalism in order to check the government of the day. But also at that same point in time, and I'm only, you can play the devil's advocate, we can only learn and hope. We can ask some of the questions which are as tough as you do, the tough questions that you ask. My question is that, isn't it also the role and the responsibility of journalism to also check the other side? And sometimes I feel, sir, this I again as a, objectively saying that sometimes we feel that everything that is shown by certain channels is that everything in our country is gloomy. At the end of the day, I'm from Bombay, and the Atal Setu was built in Bombay right now. It's a big occasion. Ram Mandir is being built, and 80% of our country is Hindu. It is a moment to celebrate, not just in terms of the mandir being built, but also an economy that is being built around that. There are some things about India, that is Bharat, that can be celebrated across the board. But sometimes, sir, do you feel that not all are able to appreciate that, and that there is only a myopic or a one point of view that comes through?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you have a short form of it?
So brevity is not my strong suit, which is why I'm not on Twitter or X. But what I will ask you is that sometimes do you feel that journalists only criticize the government and they do not acknowledge the work of the government per se?
I think criticizing governments is perhaps one of the most important things journalists do and should do. I don't by any means say that reporting on the good work the government does should not be done, and even praising the government when it does good work should not be done. But the long form of your question suggested that journalists ought to be doing and reporting stories that make people feel happy. This is an old complaint. It's not by any means either an Indian complaint, and it's certainly not a new complaint. I can remember from the 70s and the 80s, Prince Charles, and he was only the Prince of Wales at the time, asking the question, why is bad news always news? Why isn't good news news? Mm-hmm. And the example he gave is that, why is it that when a plane crashes, it is front page story and nothing else is reported for a whole day? But the 10,000 or 20,000 planes that land successfully don't get any reportage at all whatsoever. And the answer is very simple. When things go wrong, it makes news. When a plane crashes and people die, it makes news. 20,000 planes landing and taking off successfully is not news, because that is precisely what they are meant to be doing. Now ask yourself the same question about the government. A government working successfully, honestly, efficiently, and in the interest of the people is what it's elected to do. Certainly, you must acknowledge that it has achieved certain landmarks that it set for itself to achieve. But if you keep praising the government for simply doing the job it's elected to do, then you're praising them for what they were there in the first place brought to do. When governments fail and let you down, it is exceptional, and let's hope it's exceptional, by the way. In some countries, it's not that exceptional. But when governments fail to do the things they're meant to do, when governments end up with policies that are disastrous, when governments fail to tackle COVID effectively, and I'm deliberately using COVID as an example, when the economy is performing brilliantly for the business class and the industrial class, but not so for the unemployed, not so for the so-called self-employed, those are things that ought to be highlighted. Journalists in those situations are giving voice to those who don't have the capacity to speak for themselves, whose stories would otherwise not be known, whose troubles would be ignored. That is the purpose of journalism. Yes, undoubtedly, when the government does a job that is worth commenting on and worth applauding, worth complimenting, you should do so. But what is happening in our country is often the opposite. You bury deep into the newspaper, if at all you cover it, the failings of the government. And that is what should be front page news quite often.
Right. You didn't mention, and I'm glad that you acknowledged the part, that it is also important to highlight the unprecedented, sometimes unprecedented things that government does as well. And that is something that should also be covered.
Give me an example of the so-called unprecedented things that government does as well. Give me an example of what you're hinting at.
No, I'm not insinuating or hinting at anything in particular or any particular instance. I'm simply saying that if the government were to do something that was unprecedented, then that should be acknowledged by all sections of media. That is my
Absolutely,
question.
and often when governments
Correct.
do things that are unprecedented, they are undesirable as well. Don't believe for a moment that just because it's unprecedented means to say that it was desirable, it was likable, it should have been done. There are an awful lot of things that happen in our country and in other countries which are unprecedented and which are undesirable and need to be remarked upon because you're setting the wrong precedent.
Let me then come to on that note, let me ask you this question. One of the unprecedented things that is happening in our country is the building of the Ram Mandir. That is something that is happening today, and you have written in.
I don't think it's unprecedented. Mandirs have been built to Ram for centuries in our country.
but sir-
Let's be honest about it. This is not the first Ram Mandir. It is the first Ram Mandir in Ayodhya. But mandirs have been built to Ram for centuries in India, for millennia. We worshipped him as our God for millennia. We worship him in temples. And those temples have existed and have been built before. So it's not unprecedented that you build a Ram Mandir. What is unprecedented is that you're building it in Ayodhya, which is alleged to be his birthplace.
Correct. So let me rephrase that, considering you've pointed this out. But it is unprecedented that this is the first time that it is being built in Ayodhya. And the fact that this is and you've written about and you've interviewed a lot of people in your book and also the interviews that I have seen, where you have asked them saying that the concept of a Hindu Rashtra versus a secular nation. And you've spoken about this on many a platform. We are a country that is a largely 80% Hindu country. To celebrate something that is unprecedented, whether in a city, whether in a country, whether globally, for an icon or for somebody that people revere, shouldn't be that something that should be celebrated universally in comparison to being highlighted in the way that it is? And also, is there any problem in being...
Forgive me, what exactly is the question?
The question is the fact that the Ram Mandir is something that is being criticized heavily also by certain sections of media. And don't you think that that is something that should not be?
No, definitely not. Now, do you want to know why I think definitely not? Because I think you have a right to criticize and to praise. There are a lot of people who are ecstatic about the building of the Ram Mandir, and rightly so, and they should be, and they have every right to express their ecstasy, their exuberance, their exaltation to whatever extent they want. But equally, by the same token, people who are not in the same way enamored of what is happening have a right to make that clear. Why do you find one objectionable and the other not? In a free society, people have a right to express their views, which includes the right to dissent. I don't think there's anyone in media that I'm aware of that is criticizing the building of the Ram Mandir. I haven't seen any articles anywhere. I haven't seen any commentary on television anywhere that is critical of the building of the Ram Mandir. Yes, there are people who are critical about the manner in which the case was handled by the court. That's a different issue. There are certainly critics about the way the ceremony associated with the consecration of the Ram Lala statue has become political. There are people who are critical about the way this government and this Prime Minister in particular are using it to advance a political cause of their own and perhaps very possibly to advance their prospects in the forthcoming elections. But that's not being critical of the Ram Mandir. That's being critical of the way the Ram Mandir is being used. You need to be careful and distinct about what you're talking about.
I'm glad you clarified it. I'm
Well,
glad
you don't
you,
need me to clarify.
No, I'm glad
it was
you clar-
perfectly clear from the outset to anyone. You chose to misunderstand, which is why you did.
That you are right. That choosing,
You have an absolute right. You have an absolute right to misunderstand, but you chose to misunderstand.
that choosing to misunderstand, sir, and the choosing to misunderstand the statements that are coming through from news outlets is not a problem. Just that, and I would not speak only on my behalf, but so also of the few young people that I deal with. There is a lot of confusion in our country. There are a lot of polarization in our country. The fact that you mentioned this in the way you mentioned it has made it clear, at least for me. So let me jump to the
Let's
next.
talk, hang on a second. Let's talk
Right.
about polarization. Forgive me, I'm interrupting you, which is rude and it's inexcusable, but I'm doing it because I think you've raised an issue that's very important to clarify and discuss. Let's talk about polarization in our country. The worst form of polarization in our country is the way we are othering 14% of our country. Where in the world, in a democracy, right? In a democracy, do chief ministers give speeches referring to the Muslim community as Abba Jan? That's a deliberate taunt to them. Where in the world do MPs and other leaders of the ruling party repeatedly tell Muslims, go to Pakistan? That's othering them, that's polarizing them. Where do we refer to our brothers and sisters and our fellow citizens as Babar ki aulad? That's othering them, that's polarizing our country. Why shouldn't that be discussed in the media? Why shouldn't they be criticized for it? We're a secular country where everyone is an equal citizen, where everyone, regardless of their religion, caste, creed, has a right to respect. And yet you have politicians, and I'm identifying deliberately ruling party politicians, who go out of their way to other Muslims. And sadly, it happens right from the very top to the bottom. That is polarization. Should it not be pointed out in the media? It is inadequately pointed out in the media. That's the sad part of it.
So can I add on to the sad part also out here that we are a nation of 3 million temples. We are a nation of 200,000 mosques. We are the only nation, sir, in this, and very deferentially, we are the only nation in which we have all of these cultures and communities coexisting. And we are yet the only nation that, and these instances that you've pointed out, I am not saying that they should be exonerated. I think they should be asked these tough questions for sure. But we're the only nation in the world that essentially has all this diversity in that same nation, and we've continued to coexist in the India that is Bharat. So that also needs to be given some credit at the same point in time. So what I'm trying to say, sir, is that there is this big debate between Hindu Rashtra versus a secular nation. So sometimes I feel that the very concept of Hinduism or Hindutva or being a Hindu, however you look at it and call it, is that it is a Sanatan Dharma, it's a way of life. Being a Hindu and building a Hindu nation is not necessarily mutually exclusive, some would say, to a secular country. What are your views on an idea of India? Should it be a Hindu Rashtra? Should India be a Hindu Rashtra? Should it be a secular
India
nation? Do you
is
see
not a Hindu Rashtra as far as I know. Constitutionally, we are a secular country. The Prime Minister has taken an oath when he assumed office on 2 occasions to honor, protect the Constitution. A critical aspect of our Constitution is secularism. Secularism means that all religions are equal in the eyes of the government, equal in the eyes of the law, equal in the treatment that we give to the adherents of those faiths. So I think I don't fully understand your question. Are you suggesting we should stop being a secular country? Is that your...
So the word secular was, which what I'm trying to say, is not necessarily a word which was already there in our constitution, as of course everybody very well knows that it was introduced per se.
No, but hang on a second. It was introduced into the preamble during the emergency. The concept of secularism is
Is the
inherent.
concept, sorry sir, sorry that I'm interrupting you, isn't the concept of secularism the concept of Hindutva in itself, or the
No, it's
concept
not.
of...
But are we having a debate about secularism versus Hindutva?
No, I'm just asking.
I thought we were going to talk about books in a literature festival,
I'm asking-
and I thought the books that I was invited to talk about were Sound and Fury. There's been an awful lot of sound and a lot of fury, but none of it to do with my book.
No, you've interviewed so many and you've asked them this question, therefore I thought, let me pick your interest and ask you whether you believe in a
I
particular
ask
school.
questions because that is my job as a journalist to do. I ask questions, hopefully, without necessarily conveying what my opinion of the subject that I'm questioning someone about is. Sometimes it is obvious, sometimes it is not. I come from a tradition where I believe that journalists should have the capacity and the integrity to be able to question anyone and everyone, particularly on issues to do with what they are saying, issues to do with what they are doing as politicians, as authors, as actors, as actresses, or whatever. That is the job of a journalist, particularly an interviewer, particularly an anchor.
Let me
I
then-
ask questions because that is my job.
Let me come to something in regards to what you've just mentioned in terms of your book. We've had a serious conversation on all of these subjects because we have somebody as erudite as you who's come to a literature festival that is bringing both sides together. Therefore, I started with these questions. But let me now ask you, in terms of your favorite interview, if you were to rate as one interview as an interview that was your personal favorite, which you mentioned in the book, where there is more sound and less fury, which one would
I
it be?
don't have a favorite interview, sadly. I've done, I would say, several thousand during the course of my career as a journalist. I remember I began with TV in 1982, that is 40 years ago. Looking back on that span of time, I don't really have a single interview that stands up as my favorite. There are several that I was happy with. There are several that I was not pleased with, where I thought that perhaps I had not functioned as a journalist effectively, where I had let myself down perhaps. But to say, do I have a single interview that I call my favorite, or do I have a single that I think is an all-time dreadful interview? No is the truthful answer to both. I don't have one that I can identify.
Anything in the last so very many years that you've been a journalist that you regret asking anybody on stage or otherwise?
Anything that I regret asking someone?
You think that if it wasn't perhaps asked, then it would have been better for the interview that you were conducting? Because you're known to ask all the hard-hitting questions. I have seen some of them.
There's very rarely a question that I regret asking. I can't think of one instantly. I'm trying very hard to do so. Sometimes I regret interrupting people because people take their own time and they have their own way of answering questions. But that is not really a question when you interrupt someone. It's simply a response to the fact that I think they are going off the subject or they're wandering and I need to bring them back to the subject. But is there an outright question that I started an interview with or ended an interview with that I regret? Not that I can think of.
I'm glad that we have this on record as well, that you were very happy with all the questions that you've asked. And the reason why I say this...
You're misinterpreting me. Forgive me. I didn't say I'm very happy with all the questions I asked. You asked me a very distinctly different question. You asked me, is there any question you regret asking? And I said, I can't think of a specific question that I regret asking.
So, sir-
That doesn't mean I'm very happy with all the questions I asked.
So let me then rephrase it and then ask you directly, is there any question that you think that you were not very happy with asking, which you realized in retrospect that this is something that you could have avoided?
No. I don't think anyone who does interviews for a living thinks back over 40 years and remembers questions that were asked. You know, interviews happen, they move on, and you move on as well. It's part of, it's like races that you run. You know, you run a race, some go well, some go badly, you worry about them for a while, and then you move on, and they disappear into the background. And that is true of interviews, particularly if you do, as I do at the moment, 4 or 5 a week, each of which is roughly about 30, 35 minutes long. So you don't ponder over questions for very long. And remember, loads of questions are responses to things that people have said. You have in your mind a structure of questions that you want to ask because you need to have a sort of backbone around which you work. But you often have to discard it or start amending it because what you hear may not necessarily be what you had anticipated. And you start then changing your structure in accordance with the manner in which you're getting answers from the other side. So I don't ponder over my interviews in the way your question would require me to do.
Right. Now, I only ask this because for ones who are starting out in journalism, for the ones who are trying to understand how things work, sometimes we think about what has just happened and we think saying that should we have done things differently. But of course, now that you've mentioned this, and
one should always bear in mind that you can do things differently. There are many ways in which you can interview a person, many subjects on which you could question him or her, many different ways in which those questions can be asked, many different ways in which those interviews can be structured. That is, as I would call it, the genius of the human mind. I might choose to interview, to take an example, the foreign minister on a particular set of subjects because those are, I believe, of interest to me or would be of interest to the audience. Someone else interviewing the same person probably on the same day would choose a completely different set of subjects. That's because the genius of the human mind is that you find things of interest that may not necessarily be the same as the next door person. So there's no set of questions that always need to be asked. It depends upon when you're doing the interview, why you're doing the interview, who's doing the interview, what subjects the interview is on. What you can do is devise structures, but subjects, questions, those will change from person to person.
What are the 3 learnings that you would impart to young people from your book, Sound and Fury? What are the 3 big takeaways for young people from that book, and why should they read it?
I have a horrible feeling you haven't either. But let's leave that aside. Sound and Fury is actually a collection of transcripts of interviews that I've done during the COVID years. It was suggested by the editor of the company that published it, and I thought it was a good idea. Basically, there are no 3 takeaways from that that you can give as learning, so to speak, to people, because it's a collection of interviews. There is a introduction to the book that explains in detail how I look upon interviews and how I would distinguish between different types of interviews, what would be the approach of the interviewer in each of those cases, and other such things. But that's the introduction to the book, which obviously you haven't read and you're not interested in. You're asking me what are the takeaways from the interviews, and I'm not sure there are takeaways. These were interviews that were at the time topical. I thought they were important. Some of them would last longer as interesting interviews. Others have a shelf life that is shorter. But I'm not sure how to distill from them takeaways. If you talk to me about the introduction, perhaps how I approach interviews, I could help there. But from the interviews themselves, it depends on you. There were interviews with judges, there were interviews with COVID, there were interviews with politicians, each of which was interesting, but I would not say an interview that's necessarily an all-time great. I think the best way of interviewing a politician is to identify 1 or 2 subjects that he or she is connected with, which are topical and which you wish to explore, so that you give the interview to start with a focus. If you don't identify 1 or 2 subjects in that way, it becomes a very general sweep discussion, which often becomes very dangerous because it lacks focus. Secondly, having done that, what I like to do, because this is how I was taught when I first got into television, is structure the interview. Think of the question you want to ask and try and locate the person that you're interviewing as if he or she is between the horns of a dilemma, the 2 horns of a dilemma, right? In other words, The most interesting current affairs interviews are where you locate people between the two horns of a dilemma. And this is where a current affairs interview differs from a news. A news interview is simply something has happened, you want to know what's happened, what you propose to do with it, what you propose to do next. That is an interview that is dependent upon your curiosity to find out more. That is a news interview. A current affairs interview is where you locate someone within the two horns of a dilemma and you try and push them either in one direction or another. And when I structure it, I try and think about what are the possible answers I could get and think of responses from me to those possible potential answers. And let me leave you with a very interesting thought that was given to me by John Burt, who was director at London Weekend Television when I was there, and he then went on to become Director General of the BBC. And he said something which in effect is very telling. He said there are really only 4 answers in this world. Yes, no, don't know, won't tell. And the job of a current affairs interviewer is to collapse the don't know answers and the won't tell answers into either yes or no. Because in both cases, the person is actually trying to dodge you. Right? Bear that in mind when you do the structure. But I think the most important thing when you interview with politicians is identify the 2-3 subjects so that you have focus, structure it, right? Think of what could be the potential answers you get and think of what you'll say in response to those potential answers so that you can carry on a discussion. The worst sort of current affairs interview is where you are unprepared and it becomes very obvious because you're actually thinking desperately hard of the next question to ask because you haven't got a structure in your mind of where you want to go.
Have you specifically asked a hard question for a specific person
Have I ever asked a hard question of the Prime Minister?
before becoming the PM?
Yes. I don't know whether you consider it a hard thing or not, but I did an interview with Mr. Modi when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. It was done in October 2007, if I've got the month right. And it lasted, I think, for roughly 2 minutes and 40 seconds.
Have you asked about a SIT committee, which is given clear chit to Modi?
SIT committee? Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you know. We have it on YouTube.
No, because the interview I did with Mr. Modi was long before I think the SIT committee was set up. It was done in October 2007. I haven't spoken to Mr. Modi or seen Mr. Modi in person since then.
Have you asked such a question for the Congress side? Hard question.
Several. I have several tough interviews with congressmen where in the middle they have walked out, but usually they have walked back in again. And that is also true of Mr. L.K. Advani, who I have asked tough questions to. On one occasion he walked out, and within minutes he walked back. And one of the things that I have hold him in high regard, and I've written about this in my book, Devil's Advocate, is that he was the one person who, when he walked back in, having walked out, apologized to the crew. And I said to myself, this is an incredible man. He was Deputy Prime Minister of India, and he was accepting that he'd made a mistake and let himself down. And he apologized to the crew for having walked out, came back in and finished the interview.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I would just like to ask one simple question. Like, I have got a list of the people that you interviewed in your book. So some would say that, like, you are asking questions, you are interviewing people that are specifically from the left of the politics. So if you don't ask questions from a diverse group of people, you are only getting answers of a diverse, like a specific area.
I agree with you completely, but who is to blame for that?
Like, won't I blame the interviewer like he's only
the
asking
simple reason that in fact I am unable to question people from the BJP, people from this government, is because they boycott me. It's written in great detail in my book, Devil's Advocate. There's an entire chapter in the book on the problems I've had with the BJP and how many people believe that those problems go back to the interview that he was referring to done in October 2007 with Mr. Modi. If people do not give you interviews and actually believe there is a virtue in boycotting a journalist, then what is that journalist to do? There are endless BJP ministers that I have approached for interviews. They don't even any longer bother to reply. And I'll be honest with you and say that my good friend Swapan is one exception and perhaps the only exception. The only exception that in the last 6 years from the BJP who has given me an interview. The only solitary exception, and I'm very grateful to him, and I think he did it because we're old friends, and also perhaps because he doesn't believe in boycotting people. But I invite you to read the last chapter of Devil's Advocate. In great detail is the answer to the question there, in the last chapter. Now, I don't think those were the words, but you're right. I watched it last night, which is why I'm saying this to you. It was a video magazine called Eyewitness. The program was made in 1992, and I think you were seeing the January edition of 1993. And what it did, you're absolutely right. It said, and I remember this very clearly, that only 60%, but it didn't say strong 40%. And you're right. Even I remarked on it yesterday when I saw it, because I was seeing it after 30 years, and I said to myself, it's bizarre. If 60% support any government today, it would be considered a pretty good result of great support. Obviously, that was an element of unconscious.
Close it because he's got to
Certainly, I would say, you're right, you're absolutely right, 100% right in picking that up. It was a badly phrased moment. And certainly one should not have said only 60%. Because 60% would be considered good support. And there was an attempt there, I suppose, and not that unconscious either, at trying to make it seem that he had suffered and his credibility had suffered. Quite clearly, that 60% would suggest his credibility hadn't suffered very much. And I noticed it myself last night when I was watching it. So you're absolutely right to point it out. I'll tell you. The first golden standard of objectivity is to learn to accept you make a mistake. Journalists are not gifted by God not to make mistakes. They do. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post make errors. Television channels like BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera make errors. But when you do, you admit them, you correct them, and you make it equally clear that you made a mistake, just as you did when you as prominently portray the fact you made a mistake. Quite often, and this is a mistake papers make, is that they will admit to an error, but they'll bury the admission in the back page, right? So that no one can accuse them of not having admitted to the error, but it won't have been done with the same prominence. And that, I think, is wrong. So to err is human, and journalists are human, and journalists will often err. Whether it's a factual report that you're talking about, or whether it's an opinion which they change their mind about. But you need to be honest about it, and you need to be upfront. And so you're absolutely right in pointing out that that phrase, only 60%, was wrong. And I had forgotten all about it because it was 32 years ago, but I, by pure coincidence, was stunned when The Wire found this and put it up and made us all 2.5 hours. And I said, let's watch it for fun. I was watching it last night. And even I was absolutely stunned when I heard, I don't think it was me, I think it was one of the reporters on the team talking about only 60%, but I was stunned too. Anyway, when I say it was only a reporter on the team, I was the executive producer of the product, and so everything that was said, everything that was done is being done with my knowledge and with my consent, and therefore if an error is made by a reporter, the error is made by me. So I'm happy to admit it, no problem. I don't think journalists are infallible.
So I'll just quickly say this before we formally end. There's a quote, the Sanskrit shlok that I believe in, goes by Amantram Aksharam Nasti, Nasti Mulamanuksham, Ayogya Purusho Nasti, Yojakas Tatra Durlabha. It basically says that there is no medicine, there is no man that is perfect. There is no person that you cannot learn from. It is only that the right kind of information and the right kind of teacher is not available. I believe that you can learn from people from different walks of life. You can learn from people from all stratas of society and people who hold different beliefs and different views. I am very grateful that got this opportunity, and thank you very much for both sound and fury that we saw on stage, and thank you for being so kind as to take the questions that I asked and that the students asked. Thank you very much.